The dust of Redemption Creek clung to Alara's skin like a shroud woven from the town's judgment. It settled in the fine lines around her eyes, etched deeper by sleepless nights and the constant, heavy weight of despair. Her home, a small, weather-beaten cabin on the edge of town, felt less like shelter and more like a cage. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint ghosts of a life that was now shattered. Outside, the townspeople passed by, their gazes sharp and unforgiving, pinning her under the collective burden of Silas's sins. They didn't see Alara, the woman who had mended his shirts by lamplight, who had nursed him through fevers, who had tried to believe in the man she married despite the whispers. They saw only the widow of Silas Blackwood, the man who had stolen their savings, betrayed their trust, and disappeared into the unforgiving landscape, leaving his debts and his disgrace behind like a venomous inheritance. Alara had heard the whispers before Silas left, vague rumors that clung to the air like the dust, but she had pushed them away, clinging to the sliver of hope that the man she shared her quiet life with was fundamentally decent. He had been charming, persuasive, a man of grand ideas and smooth words. Now she understood. The smooth words had paved the road to ruin, not just for him, but for her. The debts were real. The stolen money was real. And the town's fury, a raw, visceral thing, was terrifyingly real. It manifested in small, cruel ways first. The storekeeper who wouldn't meet her eyes, refusing her credit for flour she desperately needed. The women who clutched their skirts closer as she passed. The children, echoing their parents' scorn, who threw stones at her door when they thought no one was looking. Now it was escalating. Sheriff Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a grimace of disapproval, had visited yesterday. He stood on her porch, sunlight glinting off the badge pinned to his worn vest, and delivered the ultimatum. The house, built with Silas's ill-gotten gains according to the town, would be seized. Her few possessions, meager as they were, would be auctioned to recoup some of the losses. She had nothing to give them but the air she breathed, and they seemed determined to take even that. He had given her 3 days. 3 days to vacate, to disappear, to cease being a painful reminder of Silas's deceit. 3 days in a town that wanted her gone, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The sun, usually a source of warmth in this arid land, felt like a burning eye of judgment in the bleached-out sky. The wind, when it blew, carried not the scent of sagebrush but the acrid smell of banked resentment. She was an island, isolated and adrift in a sea of hostility, her own despair a rising tide threatening to drown her. Inside the cabin, the silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. Every creak of the floorboards was a threat, every shadow a lurking danger. She looked at the simple wooden table where she and Silas had shared meals, the worn armchair where he had sometimes read aloud in the evenings. These were just objects, yet they were tainted by his actions, reminders of the lie she had lived. She traced the grain of the wood on the table, her fingers trembling. She had tried to explain to Sheriff Thorne, to anyone who would listen, that she had known nothing of Silas's schemes, that she had been as deceived as they were. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. A wife must know, they seemed to believe. A wife must be complicit. Her innocence was irrelevant in the face of their collective loss and anger. They needed a scapegoat, a tangible symbol of their grievance, and she was the only one left. She walked to the small, dusty window, peering out at the street. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows. A group of men stood outside the saloon, talking in low voices, glancing occasionally towards her cabin. She knew what they were talking about. Her fate. The feeling of being watched, judged, and condemned was a constant, gnawing presence. It had been easier when Silas was just rumored to be unreliable. This open, active hostility was a different kind of pain, a public shaming that stripped away her dignity piece by piece. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a rabbit cornered by wolves. Fear, cold and sharp, was her only companion. Despair, a dull ache in her chest, was a constant reminder of her predicament. She was alone, utterly and completely, facing down the wrath of an entire town with nothing but the clothes on her back and the heavy legacy of a man she barely knew. It seemed, after all. The clock was ticking, the 3 days a rapidly shrinking horizon, and the vast, empty land beyond Redemption Creek offered no obvious refuge, only more unknown dangers. Her future seemed to consist only of displacement and continued struggle, haunted by a past that wasn't even truly hers. Alara spent the remaining daylight hours in a futile attempt to find something of value, anything that might appease the town or offer a means of escape, but the cabin yielded only meager possessions and the ghosts of empty promises. She rummaged through Silas's few belongings, left behind a worn saddlebag, some faded maps, a half-finished whittling project. Nothing of monetary worth, nothing that explained why he had done it. The maps, she noted with a bitter irony, pointed towards distant, perhaps imaginary, horizons he had talked about. She found a small, tarnished silver locket hidden in a loose floorboard. Inside, instead of a picture, was a small, folded piece of paper. Her heart hitched a confession, an explanation. She unfolded it carefully. It was a gambling IOU, for a significant sum, to a name she didn't recognize, dated months before he left. It offered no comfort, only another layer to the deceit. It wasn't even addressed to her, just tucked away, another secret kept. This was the man she had shared her life with, a stranger built on lies. Her hunger was a dull ache, easily ignored amidst the larger, gnawing fear. She had little food left, some dried beans, a bit of flour, coffee grounds thin enough to see through. Even these essentials were targets of the town's ire. She had tried to trade a small, embroidered cushion her mother had made for milk at the general store that morning. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man whose face was usually etched with weary kindness, had simply stared past her, stacking cans, refusing to acknowledge her presence until a younger man, his face hard with contempt, told her they weren't trading with her kind. Your kind, the widow of a thief, a pariah. The cushion, a small piece of her past, a link to love and security, felt heavy and worthless in her hands. She clutched it now, sitting on the edge of the hard, uncomfortable chair, the silence pressing in on her. The second day was drawing to a close. One more day until Sheriff Thorne returned. The thought of leaving was terrifying, but the thought of staying was equally so. Where would she go? The land outside Redemption Creek was wild, unforgiving. She had no skills for survival on her own, never having had to fend for herself in that way. Silas had handled everything practical outside the home, or so she had believed. Now, she saw how utterly unprepared he had left her, not just financially, but in every sense. He had stripped her of agency, leaving her dependent and then abandoning her to face the consequences of his actions alone. She looked at her hands used to mending, cooking, tending a small garden. Were they capable of building a shelter, finding water, protecting herself from the dangers of the wilderness or the dangerous people who sometimes drifted through it? The uncertainty was a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. As darkness fell, she lit a single candle, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows that only amplified her fear. She ate a small handful of the dry beans, forcing them down past the lump in her throat. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder, every gust of wind outside the window a potential threat. She heard the distant sound of laughter from the saloon, a jarring contrast to her isolation. The town was living its life, oblivious to her terror, or perhaps actively enjoying her downfall. She couldn't distinguish between the two. Sleep was a distant hope. She sat by the window, hidden by the thin curtain, watching the street. The same group of men from earlier were still there, their forms dark shapes against the fading light. They weren't just talking now. They were pointing towards her cabin. The pit in her stomach deepened. It wasn't just seizure of property they wanted. Felt more personal, more malicious. They wanted her gone, broken, erased. The thought solidified, chilling her to the bone. This wasn't just about Silas's debts. It was about their need for retribution, and she was the easiest target. She was alone, vulnerable, and running out of time in a place that saw her as nothing more than the embodiment of their betrayal. The air grew colder, the silence outside punctuated only by the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance, a sound as lonely and desolate as she felt. The darkness outside seemed to mirror the despair closing in around her heart. On the third morning, Elara awoke not to sunlight, but to the ominous sound of heavy boots on her porch. Sheriff Thorne was back, and with him were two men she recognized as town elders, their faces grim and unyielding. Her 3 days were up. She stood by the door, her few belongings gathered into a small satchel at her feet, the locket, a change of clothes, the embroidered cushion, a tin of matches, a knife Silas had rarely used. Nothing else was truly hers, bought with her own coin. They entered without invitation, their eyes sweeping over the meager interior with thinly veiled contempt. "Time's up, Mrs. Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of any sympathy. One of the elders, Mr. Peterson, a man whose general store was one of those Silas had defrauded, spoke next, his voice raspy with age and bitterness. "You understand, this ain't personal, Elara. It's about justice. Silas stole from this town. From honest folk." Elara flinched at her name on his lips, feeling the weight of his accusation. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I swear I didn't know," Peterson scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "A wife knows, especially about money like that. Don't play innocent." The other elder, Mr. Gable, a stout man with eyes like chips of ice, pointed towards her satchel. "That's it? That's all you've got?" "It's all that's mine," she replied, her voice gaining a fragile firmness. Thorne stepped forward, reaching for the satchel. "We'll need to see what you've got there. Might be something of value he left behind." Elara clutched the satchel tighter. "No. This is mine." "It's not Silas's." Thorne's expression hardened. "Don't make this harder, Elara. The law says we can seize anything of his. And frankly, given what he did, the town feels you owe us more than just your husband's property." The implication hung heavy in the air. They felt entitled to hers, too. As Thorne reached for the satchel again, there was a movement outside. A figure detached himself from the shadows near the edge of her small yard. He was tall, lean, with a quiet competence about his bearing that set him apart from the townsmen. He wore practical, worn clothes and carried a worn leather satchel of his own. It was the man she had seen arrive in town a couple of days ago, the one who kept to himself, observing more than interacting. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, stopping a few feet from the porch, his gaze steady on Thorne and the elders. He didn't speak, didn't gesture. He simply stood there, a silent, watchful presence. Thorne paused, his hand hovering near Elara's satchel, his gaze flicking towards the stranger. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. The stranger hadn't said a word, but his mere presence seemed to challenge the easy authority Thorne and the others had assumed. He wasn't a townsman, didn't seem to have any connection to Silas or the town's grievances. Yet he stood there, a quiet disruption to their purpose. Elara looked at the stranger, a flicker of bewildered surprise replacing her fear. Why was he here? He didn't look like he was here to help. Not in any conventional sense. His face was unreadable, weathered. His eyes, she couldn't see their color from this distance, but they seemed steady, intelligent. He radiated a stillness that was both calming and unnerving. He wasn't intervening, not yet, but his presence had injected a note of uncertainty into the scene. Thorne cleared his throat. "Something you want, stranger?" he called out, his tone wary. The stranger didn't reply immediately. He took another slow step forward, his gaze still fixed on the group on the porch. His silence was not submissive. It was measured, assessing. It made Thorne shift his weight, the confidence draining slightly from his posture. The elders looked even more uncomfortable. This was not the easy eviction they had anticipated. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the stranger's quiet refusal to be ignored creating a sudden, unexpected obstacle. Elara held her breath, watching the silent confrontation unfold, unsure whether this was a reprieve or simply a delay to her inevitable fate. The stranger's stillness held a power that words often lacked, a quiet strength that defied easy dismissal. The stranger remained silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over Thorn, the elders, and finally resting briefly on Alara before returning to the sheriff. His eyes, she now saw, were a clear, light gray, sharp and intelligent, missing none of the dynamics playing out. They held no judgment for her, only a quiet, steady observation. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, quiet, but carried easily in the tense air. "Seems like you got your hands full, Sheriff." It wasn't a question or an accusation, merely a statement of fact, delivered without inflection. Thorn bristled slightly. "This here is town business, stranger. Got nothing to do with you." The stranger tilted his head slightly. "Business? Looks more like harassing a woman." His tone was still neutral, conversational almost, but the words were a direct challenge. The elders sputtered. "She's the widow of Silas Blackwood. He robbed this town blind," Peterson exclaimed, his voice cracking. The stranger's gaze shifted to Peterson. "Did she?" His question hung in the air. "Did she steal the money?" Thorn stepped forward, asserting his authority. "She benefited from it, and her property is forfeit for his debts." The stranger finally moved, taking a few steps closer to the porch, but still keeping a respectful distance. "Property bought with stolen money, maybe," he conceded, his voice still calm. "But seems like she ain't got much more than what's rightfully hers now. That satchel, does it look like the spoils of a robbery?" He gestured towards Alara's meager bundle with his chin. His words were simple, logical, cutting through the emotional rhetoric of the townsman. Gable interjected, his face red. "It's the principle of the thing. She's tied to him. This town wants justice." The stranger paused, considering them. "Justice," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Or vengeance?" His quiet questions, delivered without heat or anger, seemed to disarm the townsmen more effectively than any shouting match. They were used to dealing with fear or bluster. This calm, rational challenge to their actions was unexpected. Thorn, sensing the momentum shifting, straightened. "Look, stranger, I don't know who you are or why you're sticking your nose in, but this is happening. She's leaving." Now, he took a step towards Alara again, his hand extended for the satchel. Before he could reach her, the stranger spoke again, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of finality. "I'm Caleb, and I'm staying in Redemption Creek for a spell. And I don't take kindly to seeing folks pushed around when they ain't done nothing wrong themselves." He looked directly at Thorn. "She didn't steal the money. Silas did. He's gone. Punishing her for his sins? That ain't justice, Sheriff. That's just plain cruel." His declaration, "I'm Caleb," coupled with his calm defiance, seemed to plant him firmly in the town's landscape, whether they liked it or not. He wasn't just passing through, a fleeting observer. He was stating his intention to stay, and to be a presence that would witness their actions. Thorn hesitated, weighing the stranger's quiet resolve against the desire to quickly conclude this unpleasant business. He didn't know Caleb, didn't know if he was fast with a gun or simply a man with a strong opinion. But there was something in his steady gaze that gave him pause. The elders looked frustrated, muttering to themselves. They had expected Alara to crumble. They hadn't accounted for an outside variable, a quiet man with an inconvenient sense of fairness. Caleb hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't made a threat, yet he had created a palpable barrier with nothing but his words and his presence. Alara, watching, felt a strange mix of relief and bewilderment. This man, a complete stranger, was defending her, challenging the town's unanimous condemnation, not with anger, but with quiet reason. It was a fragile, unexpected shield against the storm of hostility, and she held onto the hope it offered with a trembling hand. The standoff stretched, the silence punctuated only by the wind whistling around the cabin and the sound of the townsmen's uneasy breathing. Caleb held Thorn's gaze, his expression unyielding. He wasn't asking permission, he was stating a position. Thorn, accustomed to being the undisputed authority in Redemption Creek, found himself in an unfamiliar situation. This wasn't a drunken brawler or a desperate vagrant he could easily intimidate. Caleb possessed a quiet dignity that demanded a different kind of response. Finally, Thorn relented slightly, though his face remained hard. He lowered his hand from Elara's satchel. "This ain't over, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, addressing Elara directly, but his eyes kept flicking towards Caleb. "The house is still forfeit. By tomorrow morning, you need to be out." He was pressing for time, trying to regain control by setting a firm deadline. "And if she ain't?" Caleb asked quietly. Thorn turned his gaze fully back to Caleb, his expression daring. "Then she'll be forcibly removed, and anyone interfering will be dealt with." Caleb met his gaze steadily. Noted his response was simple, non-confrontational, yet it carried an unmistakable weight. It wasn't a threat, but it was a refusal to back down. Thorn scowled, sensing he had lost this particular skirmish, even if he still held the legal high ground regarding the property. He turned abruptly and walked off the porch, the two elders trailing behind him, grumbling. As they walked away, Elara heard Peterson hiss, "Who the devil is he?" Thorn's reply was low, but carried back on the wind. "Don't know. But he's trouble." Caleb watched them go, his expression thoughtful. When they were out of earshot, he finally turned his attention back to Elara, who stood frozen on the porch, clutching her satchel. He walked slowly up the steps, stopping a few feet away from her. His presence was not imposing, but it filled the space in a way that pushed back the suffocating weight of her isolation. He didn't offer false sympathy or platitudes. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes assessing. "They'll be back tomorrow," he stated calmly, stating the obvious truth. Elara nodded, unable to speak. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and tentative relief. Who was this man? Why had he done this? He glanced around the small, bare porch, then back at her. "You got somewhere to go?" Elara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes despite her efforts to control them.
"No."
"Nowhere." He didn't react with pity, just a simple nod of understanding. Figured as much. He paused, looking out towards the town, then back at her. "Got some supplies cached up by the creek. Enough for a while." He didn't explicitly offer them to her, just stated their existence. It was his way, she was beginning to realize, of offering help without making it feel like charity, leaving her dignity intact. I couldn't possibly," she began, hesitant. He cut her off gently. "It's just supplies, ma'am. Better they get used than spoil." He looked at her again, his gaze steady. "Town like this, when they turn on you, they turn hard." He wasn't wrong. He saw it clearly, the collective cruelty that had blindsided her. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, the word fragile on her tongue. "Why did you?" He shrugged slightly, a movement that seemed to encompass a lifetime of quiet observation. "Didn't like the way they were doing it. Ain't right, that was all. No grand pronouncements, no heroic speeches. Just a simple refusal to stand by and watch injustice." His simplicity was disarming. It was so different from the complex, self-serving motives she had come to expect. He was just a man who didn't like to see someone wronged. He looked towards the setting sun. "You got a place to stay tonight?" "Here," she whispered. "Until tomorrow," he nodded. "All right, I'll be nearby." He didn't say where or what he would do, but his quiet assurance settled something within her. He wasn't offering a solution to all her problems, but he was offering a moment of reprieve, a single night of not being completely alone in her fear. He turned to leave, then paused. "Name's Caleb, like I said. Didn't catch yours." "Elara," she replied, her voice stronger now. "Elara Blackwood." She braced herself for a reaction, for the flicker of judgment or distaste that always followed the name. But Caleb's expression didn't change. He simply nodded. "Elara," he said her name as if it was just that. A name, not a label burdened by someone else's crimes. It was the first time in weeks someone had said her name without accusation in their eyes. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, then walked away as quietly as he had arrived, leaving her on the porch with the dying light and a fragile, unexpected ember of hope flickering in the vast, encroaching darkness. His silence was a promise, his presence a shield, however temporary. Caleb kept his word. Elara didn't see him that night, but she felt his presence. She slept fitfully, still on edge, but the sharp edge of terror had dulled slightly. She knew he was out there, a quiet sentinel in the darkness, his stillness a counterpoint to the town's restless hostility. She heard the distant sounds of the night, coyotes, the wind, the occasional creak of her cabin settling. But beneath it all, there was the felt sense of watchful calm. He hadn't invaded her space, hadn't demanded anything, simply existed as a buffer. It was a subtle, profoundly comforting form of protection. Morning arrived, harsh and bright, painting the dust of Redemption Creek in unforgiving shades of gold and brown. Alara rose before the sun, the knowledge of the looming deadline heavy in her chest. She made the last of her thin coffee, watching the sky lighten through the dusty window. She didn't know what Caleb planned to do, or if he planned to do anything beyond standing there quietly again. But his intervention yesterday had already changed something. It had broken the town's united front, introduced doubt into their certainty. And it had given her a small breath, a moment to steel herself. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows, she saw them approaching Sheriff Thorne, the elders, and several other men from the town, their faces set in grim determination. This time, there was no hesitation in their stride. They were coming to finish it. Alara stood by her open door, her satchel beside her, her back straight. She wouldn't cower inside. She would face them, whatever the outcome. As they reached her yard, Caleb emerged from behind the large cottonwood tree near the creek bed. He wasn't standing on the street this time. He was positioned slightly off to the side, between her cabin and the approaching group. He still carried his satchel, and in his hands, he held a simple, well-used shovel. Thorne stopped short, scowling. "Still here, stranger?" he called out. Caleb leaned on the shovel, his stance relaxed but alert. "Still here, Sheriff? You gonna move?" Thorne demanded. "We got business." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked from Thorne to the men behind him, his gaze taking in their determined expressions. "Business you want finished quick, I reckon," Caleb said, his voice conversational. "Get her out. Auction her stuff. Tie up Silas's loose ends." Gable stepped forward. "That's right. The town's been wronged. We need to close this chapter." Caleb nodded slowly, as if considering their point. "I understand folks want closure. Want to feel like things are set right." He paused, his gaze flicking towards Alara, standing silently by her door. "But you ain't closing nothing by putting her out on the road. Silas is gone. She's the one left holding the weight of it." He shifted his weight, leaning more heavily on the shovel. "Seems to me, Redemption Creek needs a different kind of closure." The townsmen looked at each other, confused by his words. What was he talking about? Caleb continued, his voice gaining a quiet authority. "I've been hearing about what Silas did. Seems he was mighty good at spinning straw into gold, at least in folks' minds. Made him think he was building something real, something valuable." He looked directly at Peterson, the storekeeper. "Made you think your investments were safe, didn't he?" Peterson scowled, but didn't deny it. "He talked about plans," Caleb went on. "Big ideas for the town, improving things." Folks believed him. He looked towards the creek, then back at the men. "Seems to me if you want to get back what Silas took, you gotta build something real. Something that lasts. Not just tear down what's left." Thorne was losing patience. "What are you talking about, stranger? We're here about the house. About her debt." Caleb straightened up, gripping the shovel. "I'm talking about work, Sheriff. Hard work. Work that puts something back into this town. Instead of just taking." He gestured with the shovel towards the dry, dusty ground surrounding Alara's cabin, land that hadn't been effectively used. "This land here, Silas talked about irrigating it, didn't he? Making it grow things? Promised folks it'd bring prosperity." A few of the men nodded reluctantly. Silas had indeed spun such tales. "Well," Caleb said, his voice firm now, "talk is cheap, but work ain't. I figure, this land needs working. Needs digging, ditching, bringing water. Requires sweat and time. It's not stolen money, but it's real value. something that can actually benefit the town in the long run. He looked at Alara again, a brief, acknowledging glance, then back at the townsman. I'm willing to put the work in, help make this land productive, but not if the woman who lives here is thrown out into the street. This land is part of her home, part of her history here, even if Silas twisted its potential. He leaned the shovel against his leg. How about this? Let her stay. Let her work the land with me. Whatever comes from it, after what's needed for living, goes to the town. It won't be fast money, like Silas promised, but it'll be honest. It'll be building something real, right here in Redemption Creek. A different kind of redemption. He looked at Sheriff Thorne, his gaze direct. Consider it. Labor for debt. On land Silas talked about but never worked. A way to actually build something where he only tore down. The proposal hung in the air, audacious in its simplicity and its complete departure from their plan of immediate punitive action. Labor for debt, on land Silas had used as a backdrop for his lies. It was a tangible way to address the wrong, not by destroying the innocent party left behind, but by creating something of value from the very ground Silas had misrepresented. Thorne was taken aback. This wasn't just interference. It was a proposition, one that appealed, however grudgingly, to a sense of practical gain that often underscored the town's outrage. The elders exchanged looks. Peterson stroked his chin thoughtfully. Gable seemed less convinced, still focused on retribution. Work? Gable scoffed. What kind of work could she do? She's a woman. And you? Who are you to offer this? Caleb met Gable's skepticism head-on. I work the land. Done it my whole life. I know how to find water, how to make things grow where they don't want to. And she, he nodded towards Alara, has a right to her home, and a chance to earn her place back, not have it stripped away because of another's actions. The debt collector in the next town over knows me, he added, a quiet note of credibility entering his voice. Mr. Abernathy. You can ask him if I'm a man of my word, or if I know how to work. He was offering not just a plan, but a verifiable reference, a way for them to trust him in a town built on broken trust. The townsmen were visibly divided. Some still clung to their anger, wanting immediate, visible punishment. Others, however, were weighing Caleb's words. Honest work, building something real, potentially recouping losses over time. It was a different kind of satisfaction than merely kicking a woman out. It was also a solution that removed the unpleasant task of dragging Alara from her home, potentially creating a scene, especially with Caleb standing there. Sheriff Thorne, the pragmatist, saw the appeal. It was a way to address the town's grievance without the messiness of outright cruelty, while also potentially yielding a long-term benefit. It shifted the focus from tearing down to building up, using Silas's legacy as a perverse foundation for honest labor. He looked at Alara, then at Caleb, who stood quietly, shovel in hand, waiting for their decision. The air was thick with unspoken considerations, the balance tipping precariously between resentment and potential. Sheriff Thorne rubbed his chin, his gaze going between Alara and Caleb. The proposal was unorthodox, unexpected, but it had a certain logic to it. It was a way to show the town was getting something back, something tangible and potentially lasting, rather than just seizing a nearly empty cabin and meager possessions. It also deflected the awkwardness of forcibly removing Alara, especially with Caleb's quiet presence complicating things. Work the land, Thorne mused aloud, half to himself. Irrigation. Silas did talk a big game about that. Peterson spoke up, cautiously hopeful. Making this land productive. That could benefit everyone. Less reliance on the next town over for goods. Gable, however, remained skeptical. And what guarantee do we have this ain't just another one of Silas's lies? That this stranger ain't just buying time for her? Caleb stepped forward, driving the shovel blade into the dry earth near the porch with a solid thud. The guarantee is the work itself, he stated plainly. You'll see the ditches being dug. You'll see the water flowing. You'll see things growing. Takes time, yes, but it's honest. And you can see it happening with your own eyes. He looked at Gable directly. If the work stops, if nothing grows, then you can do what you came to do. But give it a season. Give her a chance. Give this town a chance to build something instead of just holding on to its anger. He was offering a test, a probationary period, a way for the town to verify the sincerity of his proposal through tangible progress. Thorne considered this. A season. It wasn't unreasonable. It offered a path forward that felt less like petty vengeance and more like pragmatic recovery, albeit slow. It also diffused the immediate tension and provided a way for the town to save face, backing down from the confrontation without appearing weak. "All right," Thorne said finally, his voice betraying his reluctance to deviate from his original plan, but acknowledging the unexpected turn of events. "A season. You work the land. You," he addressed Alara, "stay here, but you work alongside him. Whatever you grow after feeding yourselves comes to the town accounted for. We'll monitor the progress," he pointed at Caleb. "If, by the end of the growing season, there's nothing to show for it, or if either of you disappear, the deal's off. The cabin will be seized, and you'll be out, no second chances." He was laying down clear conditions, trying to assert control over the unexpected agreement. "Agreed," Caleb said, his response immediate and firm. Alara, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of disbelief and rising hope, finally found her voice. "Agreed," she echoed, her voice slightly trembling but resolute. She looked at Caleb, a stranger who had inexplicably offered her a lifeline, and saw not a savior, but an unexpected partner in a difficult task. He wasn't promising ease, but he was offering a path forward, a chance to earn her place, to build something real from the ashes of Silas's deceit. The townsmen still looked uncertain, some openly disgruntled, but Sheriff Thorne's decision was final. They had a new, temporary arrangement. The threat of immediate eviction was lifted, replaced by the daunting challenge of making dry land yield life under the watchful, skeptical eyes of the town that still condemned her. As the townsmen dispersed, muttering among themselves, Alara remained on the porch, watching them go. The silence returned, but it was different now, filled with the echoes of the agreement and the unspoken understanding between her and Caleb. He stood where he was, leaning on the shovel, his gaze following the retreating figures. When they were gone, he turned back to her. "All right," he said, his voice practical. "First thing we need is water. The creek's low, but there's an old channel Silas talked about diverting. Probably just talk, but worth checking out." He was already moving forward, his mind on the work, not the drama. He didn't ask her if she was ready, didn't offer words of comfort. He simply assumed she was capable, that she would meet the challenge. And in that assumption, he gave her a quiet strength. He wasn't treating her like a victim, but like someone who could work, who could contribute. It was a profoundly different way of being seen than the town's perception of her as a pariah or a symbol of grievance. "Show me," she said, her voice clear and steady. She picked up her satchel, setting it back inside the cabin for now. She had a new purpose, a new fight. It wasn't against Silas's ghost or the town's anger, but against the stubborn earth itself. Caleb nodded and began walking towards the creek bed, his steps measured and ground covering. Alara followed, falling into step behind him. The distance between them was respectful, acknowledging the newness of their partnership and the vastness of what they faced. But there was also a sense of shared purpose, a quiet understanding that they were in this together, bound by an unlikely agreement and the need to prove the town wrong. The sun was climbing higher, promising a hot day, a day for hard work. Alara looked at the dry, cracked earth, then at the shovel in Caleb's hand. It was a long road ahead, a season of sweat and uncertainty, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a stir of something other than fear and despair, determination. Caleb's intervention had not wiped away the past, but it had opened a door to a future she would have to build with her own hands, alongside this quiet, stoic stranger who had given her a chance when everyone else had shut her out. His quiet stand had not solved everything, but it had given her the space to begin the slow, arduous process of earning her own clean slate. The work was hard, unrelenting. The ground was dry, resistant, packed down by years of neglect and the harsh sun. Alara had gardened, but she had never dug trenches, wrestled with rocks, or felt the sun beat down with such relentless intensity for hours on end. Caleb worked steadily, methodically, teaching her as they went, not with words, but with quiet demonstration. He showed her how to hold the shovel to minimize strain, how to brace her foot, how to follow the subtle contours of the land to find the most efficient path for a ditch. His movements were economical, practiced, honed by years of physical labor. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, quiet guide. They started by clearing the overgrown banks of the creek, searching for signs of Silas's fabled channel. It was backbreaking work, pulling up tangled roots, moving stones, clearing away debris. Elara's muscles ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her hands, once smooth, quickly became calloused, blistered. But with every shovelful of earth turned, with every rock moved, she felt a different kind of strength building within her. A physical resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The work demanded all her focus, leaving little room for the gnawing fear and despair that had consumed her before. Days blurred into a rhythm of labor, rising before dawn, eating a meager breakfast of beans or dried fruit, walking to the creek bed, and digging until the light faded. They ate lunch in the shade of the cottonwood tree, sharing their simple food in companionable silence. Elara began to notice things about Caleb. The way he shielded his eyes against the sun, the slight limp he favored after long hours, the quiet satisfaction in his eyes when he completed a particularly difficult section of digging. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was patient, persistent, and deeply connected to the land. He treated her with a quiet respect that was a balm to her bruised spirit. He didn't push her beyond her limits, but he expected her to work hard, and she met his unspoken expectation with a fierce determination. The townspeople watched them, sometimes from a distance, sometimes riding by slowly on horseback. Elara felt their eyes on her, still judging, still skeptical. The work was a public spectacle, a test they expected her to fail. But Caleb's presence beside her, his unwavering focus on the task at hand, created a small bubble of purpose that seemed to deflect some of the town's scrutiny. They weren't just the widow Blackwood and some stranger anymore. They were two people working the land, engaged in a tangible task that defied the town's narrative of her helplessness and Silas's ephemeral promises. After a week of searching, Caleb found it, a faint depression in the land, partially filled with silt and overgrown, but unmistakably the remnants of a hand-dug channel leading away from the creek. Silas hadn't entirely lied. He had started the work, perhaps just enough to fuel his grand stories before abandoning it. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It proved there was a basis for Caleb's proposal, a tangible starting point. Their work now shifted to clearing and deepening this old channel, a task that felt slightly less impossible knowing it had been attempted before. Elara found a surprising satisfaction in the physical labor. It was honest, straightforward. Digging, clearing, shaping the earth with her own hands felt real in a way Silas's promises never had. It was a slow, arduous process of building, a stark contrast to the sudden, devastating collapse of her previous life. She saw the ditch grow longer, deeper, a visible testament to their efforts. Caleb worked alongside her, his movements steady, his silence companionable rather than isolating. They communicated mostly through gestures, shared glances, the rhythm of their digging spades hitting the earth. A quiet partnership was forming, built not on shared history or eloquent words, but on shared sweat and a mutual commitment to the task. The sun beat down, the dust swirled, but in the heart of the labor, Elara was beginning to find a fragile sense of self, separate from Silas's shadow and the town's condemnation. This work was hers. This effort was hers. And the strength growing within her was her own. The season stretched ahead, a long, hot trial, but she faced it now with a quiet resolve she hadn't known she possessed. As the weeks passed, the channel grew, a raw scar on the landscape, stretching further and further from the creek. Elara and Caleb settled into a routine dictated by the sun and the demands of the work. They spoke little, conserving energy and breath, but their shared silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the sounds of their labor, the scrape of shovels, the the grunt of effort, the splash of water as they cleared particularly muddy sections near the creek. Alara's body was leaner, stronger. Her face was weathered, but her eyes held a new, steely resolve. She could anticipate Caleb's needs, handing him a tool before he asked, knowing when he needed a moment to rest. He, in turn, seemed to know when she was flagging, offering a silent nod towards the shade or taking on a particularly difficult stretch of digging without comment. They occasionally encountered challenges. A large, embedded rock required hours of chipping away. A sudden rainstorm turned the channel into a muddy mess, undoing days of work and forcing them to start again once the water receded. Through it all, Caleb remained steady, facing each setback with a quiet pragmatism that Alara found both calming and inspiring. There were no outbursts of frustration, no complaints, just a focused determination to continue. He taught her not just how to dig, but how to endure. The town's gaze remained on them, a constant, felt presence. Some days, curiosity seemed to outweigh suspicion. Men would ride by slowly, observing the progress of the ditch, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and grudging interest. The ditch was becoming harder to ignore, a physical manifestation of Caleb's promise. It wasn't just an idea anymore. It was earth moved, labor expended. Alara still felt the weight of their judgment, but it no longer crushed her. She was too focused on the task at hand, too invested in the outcome of their work. One particularly hot afternoon, they were working on a section near the edge of the property line when Sheriff Thorne rode up, dismounting a short distance away. He walked towards them, his hat pulled low against the sun. Alara's heart tightened, but she didn't stop digging. Caleb straightened, leaning on his shovel. Thorne eyed the length of the channel they had dug. It was impressive, even to a skeptic. "Making progress, I see," Thorne said, his voice non-committal. "It's coming along," Caleb replied, his tone equally neutral. "Hard work, seems like," Thorne agreed, glancing at Alara, whose face was streaked with dirt and sweat. She met his gaze directly, neither defiant nor meek. Thorne kicked at the dirt near the edge of the ditch. "Town's still talking. Some think this is a waste of time. Just delaying the inevitable." Caleb shrugged slightly. "Talk is cheap. Dirt is real." Thorne almost smiled, a flicker of something other than sternness crossing his face. "Indeed," he paused. "Got any water flowing yet?" "Not yet," Caleb said. "Still got a ways to go to get a good flow. Need to get down a bit deeper in sections. Clear the intake better." Thorne nodded slowly, assessing the work. "Well, keep at it." He didn't offer praise, but the lack of outright condemnation, the acknowledgement of the progress, felt like a small victory. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving them to the silence and the sun. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He didn't threaten us," she said quietly. Caleb resumed digging. He seized the work. Hard to argue with dirt, his simple statement encapsulated their strategy. Let the work speak for itself. Let the tangible reality of their labor counteract the intangible weight of Silas's lies and the town's prejudice. The ditch wasn't just a way to bring water to the land. It was a symbol, a physical argument for their right to be there, for Alara's right to a clean slate earned through her own effort. They weren't just digging a ditch. They were digging their way out of the hole Silas had left her in. And with every shovelful, the hole felt a little less deep, the sun a little less punishing, and the future, however uncertain, a little more possible. The quiet partnership forged in sweat and silence was becoming her anchor in the storm of the town's judgment. Midway through the season, a significant challenge arose, one that tested both their physical limits and the fragile trust they had built. A section of the proposed channel ran directly through a large, rocky outcrop. Digging through it with shovels was impossible. They needed different tools, and more importantly, they needed to figure out a way around or through solid rock. Caleb spent several days studying the outcrop, walking its perimeter, examining the fissures and faults. Alara watched him, recognizing the quiet intensity of his focus. He wasn't just digging. He was reading the land, understanding its stubborn resistance. One evening, sitting by the dying embers of their cook fire near the cabin. Caleb finally spoke at length, explaining his plan. "We could try blasting," he said, his voice low, tracing a diagram in the dirt with a stick. "But getting powder out here is tricky, expensive, and could bring unwanted attention. And it's dangerous." Elara nodded, listening intently. "Or," he continued, "we can try splitting it. Find the fault lines, use wedges and hammers. Slower but safer. And quieter." He looked at her. "It'll mean long days with hammers and chisels. Lots of repetitive work." Elara didn't hesitate. "I can do it." The physical labor had transformed her. She was no longer the frail woman consumed by fear. She was strong, capable, and determined. Caleb nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "All right then, we'll split it." The work shifted from digging earth to battling rock. It was tedious, exhausting. Hour after hour, they hammered steel wedges into the fissures, listening for the faint ping that indicated the rock was beginning to yield. Alara's arms ached. Her hands were raw despite her calluses, but she found a grim satisfaction in the slow fracturing of the stubborn stone. During this difficult period, their unspoken bond deepened. They shared the frustration of slow progress, the small triumphs of splitting a large section of rock, the sheer exhaustion at the end of each day. One afternoon, a wedge slipped, sending a shower of rock chips flying. Elara cried out, shielding her face. Caleb was instantly beside her, his rare quick movements betraying a flicker of concern. He gently brushed dust from her cheek, examining her for cuts. His touch was light, careful. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact beyond handing her a tool. In that simple, nonverbal act of checking on her safety, he conveyed a depth of care that words could not have matched. "Just dust," she said, her voice a little shaky. He nodded, his gray eyes searching hers for a moment, assessing her not just for injury, but for her resolve. He saw her weariness, but also the unwavering determination beneath it. He didn't apologize for the danger, didn't tell her to stop. He simply retrieved the errant wedge and returned to the work, the shared moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had arisen, leaving behind a stronger sense of connection. They were partners, truly, facing the obstacles together. The rock outcrop became a symbol of their struggle, and their slow, painstaking progress through it was a testament to their resilience, not just individually, but as a unit. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. The townspeople, initially skeptical, were now openly curious. The sight of Elara, the condemned widow, swinging a heavy hammer alongside the quiet stranger was something they hadn't anticipated. It was a defiance of their expectations, a refusal to play the part of the broken victim. Some began to ride closer, asking Caleb questions about the work, about the potential for the land. He answered them with his usual economy of words, focusing on the practicalities of water and soil, steering clear of any mention of Alara's past or the town's judgment. He was building credibility not just for himself, but for their shared endeavor. As the hottest part of the season arrived, they finally cleared a path through the rock outcrop. It was a triumph, hard-won and deeply satisfying. Standing at the edge of the cleared section, looking back at the raw earth and split rock that stretched all the way back to the distant creek, Elara felt a surge of pride, a feeling that had been absent from her life for a very long time. This wasn't Silas's doing. This was theirs. This was real. They had faced a formidable obstacle and overcome it through sheer persistence and shared effort. The rock, once a symbol of the insurmountable challenges before her, was now a testament to her own strength and the quiet, unwavering support of the stranger who had chosen to stand with her. The season of work was far from over, but they had proven something important, not just to the town, but to themselves. With the rock outcrop finally conquered, the remaining digging felt almost easy by comparison, though it was still grueling work under the relentless sun. They focused on deepening the channel closer to the creek and constructing a simple intake structure to direct the water flow. Caleb's knowledge of the land and basic engineering was evident. He seemed to know instinctively where to place stones, how to build the earth banks to withstand the flow. Elara worked alongside him, her movements now confident, her body hardened by months of labor. She could handle a shovel, a pickaxe, a wheelbarrow filled with earth, with efficiency she never would have dreamed of before. The townspeople's interest intensified. They saw the ditch nearing completion, a visible line drawing closer to the dusty land around Alara's cabin. The promise of water, the lifeblood of this arid region, was a powerful incentive, slowly beginning to outweigh their lingering resentment towards Silas and his widow. Some of the men who had been most vocal in their condemnation now rode by with a different look in their eyes. Assessment calculation. If this land became productive, it could change things for Redemption Creek. It could bring real prosperity, not Silas's phantom wealth. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the nearly finished channel, Caleb stood by the creek, making final adjustments to the intake. Alara watched him from a short distance, a sense of anticipation building within her. The moment of truth was approaching. Would the water flow? Would their season of backbreaking work yield the promised result? And if it did, would it be enough to appease the town, to truly earn her a clean slate? As the light faded, Caleb finished his adjustments. He stood for a moment, looking at the creek, then at the channel stretching out into the twilight. He turned and walked towards Alara. "Ready?" he asked, his voice quiet. It wasn't just about the water. It was about everything that hung in the balance. Alara nodded, her heart pounding. "Ready." They walked back to the intake together, standing side by side at the edge of the creek. The water flowed lazily past, clear and cool. Caleb made a final adjustment, opening a small section of the bank that would allow the creek water to enter the channel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, hesitantly, a trickle of water began to seep into the dry earth of the channel. It was a small start, easily absorbed by the thirsty ground. But then, the trickle grew, becoming a steady flow, pushing forward, wetting the dry earth, darkening it from pale brown to rich, dark red. The water moved down the channel, a ribbon of life flowing into the parched land. Alara watched, mesmerized, a lump forming in her throat. It wasn't just water. It was hope. It was the tangible result of their labor, a physical manifestation of resilience and perseverance. The water flowed past where they had battled the rock, past the sections they had cleared and deepened, continuing its journey towards the land around the cabin. Caleb stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the flowing water, a quiet satisfaction on his face. He didn't say, "I told you so," or claim victory. His satisfaction was in the work completed, the task achieved. The sound of the flowing water, a gentle murmur against the quiet evening, was more eloquent than any words. It spoke of possibility, of life returning to a place that had felt dead and barren. As the light faded completely and the stars began to emerge, they stood there, watching the water flow, a silent testament to their shared effort. The season wasn't over, and the final test with the town still loomed, but they had achieved the first crucial step. They had brought water to the land. And in doing so, they had brought a flicker of hope back into Alara's life. The town might still condemn the widow, but the land, now touched by water, seemed to whisper a different story. A story of hard work, resilience, and a quiet man who saw not a pariah, but someone worth giving a chance. News of the flowing water traveled quickly through Redemption Creek. In the days that followed, more and more townspeople came to see it for themselves. They stood at the edge of the newly dug channel, watching the water flow towards Alara's property, their expressions a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and reluctant admiration. The sight of the water, a visible sign of potential prosperity, was a powerful force, slowly eroding the solid wall of their collective condemnation. Alara and Caleb immediately began preparing the land for planting. They cleared the remaining brush, turned the soil where the water could reach, and planted the seeds Caleb had brought with him, hardy vegetables, beans, squash, crops that could thrive in this climate with sufficient water. The work continued, but there was a new sense of purpose to it, a tangible goal beyond just moving earth. Alara learned to prepare the soil, to sow seeds, to weed and tend the young plants as they emerged from the ground, fragile but determined. Caleb continued to be her quiet partner, his presence a constant support. He taught her about the plants, when to water, how to protect them from pests and the harsh sun. He didn't take over, didn't diminish her contribution. He guided her, worked alongside her, treating her as a full equal in their shared endeavor. The town watched them. They saw Alara working the land, her hands in the soil, caring for the growing plants with a fierce dedication. They saw the green shoots emerging, a vibrant contrast to the surrounding dryness. It was hard to reconcile this image with the helpless, condemned widow they had expected her to be. As the plants grew stronger, producing their first tentative yields, the terms of the agreement with the town loomed larger. The harvest would be the true test, the tangible proof of whether their labor was sufficient to satisfy the town's demand for justice. Alara felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach whenever she thought about it, but she pushed it down, focusing on the work, on the plants that represented her future. Then the external threat arrived not from the town but from outside. A small gang of drifters, hearing rumors of potential prosperity around Redemption Creek, rode into town. They were rough, looking for trouble, and they saw Alara, the woman working land with a single quiet man on the edge of town, as an easy target. They rode out to her cabin one afternoon while Caleb was down by the creek, making sure the water flow was steady. Alara was in the small garden plot, tending the plants. 3 men rode up, dismounting leeringly. "Well, looky here," one of them said, a greasy-haired man with cruel eyes. Heard the widow Blackwood was finally making something of herself. Or rather, someone was making something for her. Alara straightened, her heart pounding, but she didn't back down. She had faced down the town. She wouldn't cower before these men. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "What do we want?" another man sneered. "Couple things. Maybe some of that harvest we heard about. Maybe other things." He stepped closer, his gaze dismissive and threatening. Before he could reach her, Caleb appeared, walking with his usual measured pace from the direction of the creek. He carried no weapon, just the shovel. He stopped a short distance away, his presence radiating a quiet, unwavering stillness that immediately drew the drifters' attention. "You folks lost?" Caleb asked, his voice low and calm. The leader of the drifters, a burly man, turned to face him, a condescending smile on his face. "Just having a chat with the lady, old man. Town property, ain't she? Like her husband's debts." Caleb's gaze was steady, intelligent, completely unafraid. "She's working this land," he said, ignoring the man's taunt. "Under agreement with the town. This land is providing for her." The drifter leader laughed. "Providing? Looks like she needs more providing for." He took a step towards Alara again. This time, Caleb shifted his weight, not aggressively, but with a readiness that was palpable. "You can ride on," Caleb said, his voice still quiet, but with a steel edge Alara had never heard before. "There's nothing for you here." The burly man's smile vanished. He saw something in Caleb's eyes, in his posture, that made him hesitate. This wasn't just a quiet farmer. There was a depth of capability and a willingness to stand his ground that was unnerving. The standoff hung in the air, tense and silent, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the gentle sound of water flowing in the ditch. Alara stood behind Caleb now, feeling a surge of strength from his unwavering presence. He wasn't just protecting her physically. He was standing as a bulwark against the kind of predatory cruelty she had faced alone before. His quiet strength was her shield. The leader of the drifters stared at Caleb for a long moment, weighing the unknown against the perceived easy target. Caleb met his gaze without flinching, radiating a quiet, resolute power that spoke volumes without a single boast or threat. The drifter finally seemed to decide the risk wasn't worth it. He spat on the ground. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered to his men. "Plenty of easier pickings." He turned and remounted his horse. His men followed suit, glancing back at Caleb and Alara with lingering resentment. As they rode away, the leader called back, "She's still Blackwood's widow. Town ain't forgot." Caleb watched until they were out of sight, then turned back to Alara. He walked over to her, his gaze searching. You all right? Alara nodded, her voice thick with emotion. Yes. Thank you, he gave a small, rare nod. They were just talk. Looking for easy trouble, he didn't diminish her fear, but his calmness reassured her. He looked at the plants, then back at her. We should get back to work. The threat had passed, but the test wasn't over. The town still had to pass judgment on the harvest. But facing down the drifters with Caleb by her side had changed something fundamental within Alara. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was standing her ground, and she wasn't alone. The day of reckoning arrived with the harvest. Alara and Caleb had worked tirelessly, and the land, fed by the creek water, had responded generously. The garden was a vibrant patch of green and gold, laden with ripe vegetables. It was a small but undeniable success, a tangible result of their labor that contradicted the town's expectation of failure. Sheriff Thorne, the elders, and a group of other townsmen arrived, not with wagons ready to seize, but with a more cautious air. They dismounted, approaching the garden plot, their eyes wide with surprise as they took in the abundance. Well, Peterson breathed, walking among the plants, touching a ripe squash. Didn't think you could grow much out here. Gable was silent, his face unreadable, but his eyes scanned the healthy plants with evident surprise. Sheriff Thorne walked over to Caleb and Alara, who stood side by side at the edge of the plot, the harvested vegetables piled neatly in baskets beside them. The air was tense, but different from the raw hostility of months ago. It was a tension born of uncertainty, of grudging respect vying with ingrained prejudice. The season's end, Thorne stated, his voice measured. Time to see. The yield. Caleb gestured to the baskets. It's all there, Sheriff. More than enough for us to live on, with plenty left over for the town. As agreed, Thorne examined the vegetables, firm squash, plump beans, healthy greens. It was undeniable. They had succeeded. This wasn't stolen money or empty promises. It was real food, grown from the earth through honest labor. Peterson cleared his throat. It's a good harvest. More than we expected. Gable finally spoke, a note of skepticism still in his voice. One season doesn't make up for everything. Caleb met Gable's gaze. No, he agreed quietly. It doesn't. Silas did a lot of damage. But this is a start. This value created, not taken. It's honest work. He looked at Alara. She put in the work. Every day. Faced down the sun, the rock, the doubts. She didn't run from the mess Silas left. She stayed and started cleaning it up, the only way she could. His words, simple and direct, shifted the focus back to Alara, highlighting her resilience and effort. He wasn't claiming credit for himself. He was giving it to her, emphasizing her active role in this redemption. Alara stood taller, meeting the gaze of the townsmen. She was no longer defined by Silas's crimes or the town's judgment. She was the woman who had helped dig the ditch, who had battled the rock, who had worked this land with her own hands and brought forth life from the dust. This harvest was her answer to their condemnation. Sheriff Thorne looked at the abundant baskets, then at Alara, her face marked by sun and labor but held with quiet dignity. He looked at Caleb, standing stoically beside her, his presence a silent endorsement. The narrative of the helpless, complicit widow was hard to maintain in the face of this tangible evidence of her strength and industry. The town wanted justice, wanted repayment, but they also understood and respected hard work and visible results. This harvest was undeniable. Thorne took a step forward. Alara, he said, using her name without the usual edge of accusation. The town sees the work you've done. This harvest, it's real. It's honest. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Silas's debts, they were large, but you staying here, putting in this kind of effort. It's a different kind of payment. He looked at Caleb. You offered labor for debt. Seems you've delivered, he then said, in a voice loud enough for all the townsmen to hear. This land is proven capable. And he gestured towards Alara. She's proven capable. He paused again, then made the pronouncement that held the weight of the town's reluctant acceptance. The agreement stands. The cabin is yours, Alara. You and Caleb have earned your place here. This harvest is a start. A new ledger, if you will. A clean slate, earned through sweat and soil. A ripple went through the townsmen. A clean slate. It wasn't a complete erasure of the past, but it was a public acknowledgement that Alara was no longer solely defined and condemned by Silas's actions. She had earned her own standing. The outright hostility was gone, replaced by a cautious acceptance, a recognition of her resilience and the value she and Caleb had brought to the community through their labor. As the townsmen began to examine the harvest more closely, talking among themselves about the quality of the produce, Sheriff Thorne remained for a moment, looking at Alara. It wasn't easy, he said quietly. Town was set against you. Alara met his gaze. I know, she replied. But the work is real. He nodded slowly. Yes, it is. He glanced at Caleb, a look of understanding passing between the two quiet men. Then Thorne turned and joined the others, the tension broken, the corner turned. Alara watched him go, a wave of emotion washing over her. Relief, exhaustion, and a deep, quiet sense of triumph. She had faced the worst and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger. She looked at Caleb, who was now showing Peterson the best way to store the squash. He wasn't seeking accolades, just continuing the practical work. He had given her a chance, had stood by her, and had helped her earn her way back. He hadn't fought her battles for her, but had empowered her to fight them herself, simply by providing the opportunity and standing as a quiet partner. Later that evening, sitting outside the cabin as twilight deepened, Alara and Caleb shared a simple meal of the fresh vegetables they had grown. The stars were coming out, vast and indifferent above the quiet land. The sound of the creek water flowing in the channel was a gentle, constant murmur. They called it a clean slate, Alara said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Caleb looked up at the stars. It's a start. The slate ain't clean just because someone says so. You gotta keep writing on it, with your own hand. Alara smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile that hadn't been there in a long time. He was right. The work wasn't over. Earning a place, earning respect was an ongoing process. But the heaviest burden had been lifted. She was no longer paralyzed by the past, no longer defined by Silas's shame. She was Alara, a woman who had faced down despair and hostility, who had found strength in labor and quiet partnership, who had earned her own way. She looked at Caleb, sitting beside her in the darkness, his presence a quiet comfort. He hadn't offered grand gestures or empty promises, but honest work and unwavering support. He had seen her not for who she was married to, but for who she could become. And because of that, she had found her resilience, her dignity, and a path towards a future she could build, piece by painstaking piece, right here in Redemption Creek. The condemnation of the town had been her burden, but the quiet man had given her not a handout, but the tools and the space to earn her own redemption, transforming the dust of disgrace into fertile ground for a new life.